They changed the locks and texted, "You are not family anymore." So I calmly contacted the mortgage company, released the Autopay from my name, and 3 days later a foreclosure notice appeared at their door. I, 32M, never thought I'd be the kind of person to burn bridges, but then again, I never thought my own family would light the match first. It started 3 months ago when my father had his second heart attack. I was the one who got the call at 2 in the morning, drove 4 hours through a rainstorm to reach the hospital, and sat in that sterile waiting room drinking terrible coffee while my older brother was unreachable and my sister was apparently too busy with her new boyfriend to pick up the phone. When Dad finally stabilized, the doctor pulled me aside and explained the financial reality of his care. The medications alone would run thousands monthly, and someone needed to manage his affairs since Mom had passed 5 years earlier. That someone became me. I restructured my work schedule, set up automatic payments for everything from Dad's mortgage to his utilities, and funneled money from my own savings when his pension fell short. My brother showed up once during those first critical weeks, stayed for an afternoon, then disappeared back to his life 2 states away. My sister visited twice, both times bringing her boyfriend along and spending more time taking selfies in the hospital cafeteria than actually sitting with Dad. The arrangement continued for months. I'd visit every weekend, sometimes twice a week, handling everything from grocery shopping to physical therapy appointments. Dad's house became my second home, and I'd grown comfortable with the rhythm of it all. My own apartment felt like a place I merely slept between Dad's needs and work obligations. The mortgage payments came directly from my account because Dad's fixed income couldn't cover it, not with the medical bills piling up. I never asked for thanks or recognition. He was my father, and this was what family did. Or so I believed. The shift began subtly. My sister started visiting more frequently once Dad's health improved, always with her boyfriend in tow. My brother suddenly found time to make the drive down, usually arriving on Sundays when I was already there cooking dinner. They'd sit in the living room making plans for Dad's house, discussing renovations and talking about the property value like he wasn't sitting right there listening to them carve up his legacy before he was even gone. I ignored it at first. Maybe they were finally stepping up, finally realizing that family meant more than occasional phone calls and birthday cards. But then the conversations started happening when I wasn't in the room, whispered discussions that would stop abruptly when I walked in. My sister began making comments about how I was probably tired from all the responsibility, how they could handle things from here, how I should focus on my own life. The Tuesday it all fell apart started like any other. I'd taken the afternoon off work to drive Dad to a cardiology appointment. Afterward, we stopped for lunch at the diner he loved, the one that made their burgers too greasy and their coffee too strong. He seemed distant during the meal, barely touching his food, and when I asked if he was feeling all right, he just nodded and said he had a lot on his mind. I should have pressed harder. I should have demanded to know what was bothering him. Instead, I paid the check, drove him home, and made sure he took his evening medications before heading back to my apartment. That was the last time I'd used my key to enter that house. The text message arrived while I was in a meeting the following afternoon. My sister's name lit up my phone screen, and I almost ignored it, assuming she needed me to pick something up for Dad or handle another bill. When I finally checked during my break, the words on the screen felt like a physical blow. The locks have been changed. Dad decided it's time for you to step back. You're not family anymore. We'll handle everything from here. No explanation. No phone call. Just a cold dismissal delivered through a text message like I was some stranger who'd overstayed their welcome. I called immediately, but she didn't answer. I tried my brother next, and he picked up on the 4th ring, his voice carefully neutral when he told me it was Dad's decision and I needed to respect it. When I demanded to speak with Dad directly, my brother said he was resting and couldn't be disturbed, then hung up before I could respond. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at that text message, trying to make sense of how 3 months of sacrifice had led to this moment. The rational part of my brain knew I should drive to the house, demand a face-to-face conversation, force them to explain this betrayal to my face. But the wounded part, the part that felt suddenly and completely hollow, couldn't bear the thought of standing on that porch begging for answers. Instead, I went home and opened my laptop. The mortgage account stared back at me from my banking portal, that automatic monthly payment I'd set up 7 months ago when Dad first couldn't cover it. For $1,000 every month, withdrawn like clockwork from my account to keep that house from foreclosure. They wanted to lock me out and declare I wasn't family? Fine. Family didn't come with financial obligations to people who considered you disposable. I canceled the automatic payment. 3 clicks, 1 confirmation, and it was done. The next payment was due in 5 days, and now it simply wouldn't arrive. I sat back in my chair and waited for the guilt to come, for the voice in my head that would tell me I was being petty and cruel. It never came. Instead, I felt nothing but a cold, clear certainty that I'd made the right choice. Those 5 days passed in a strange fog. I threw myself into work, picked up extra projects, stayed late at the office finding excuses not to go home to my empty apartment. My phone stayed silent. No calls, no texts, no attempts at explanation or reconciliation. They'd meant what they said, and the silence confirmed it more thoroughly than any words could have. The foreclosure notice arrived on day 8. I knew because my sister called 17 times that morning, her voicemails progressing from confused to angry to desperate. My brother left messages too, his carefully neutral tone replaced with something approaching panic. Dad never called, and somehow that hurt more than everything else combined. I let them sweat for 2 days before I finally answered my sister's call. She launched into a frantic explanation about the foreclosure notice, how there must have been some mistake, how they needed me to fix it immediately. I let her talk until she ran out of steam, then asked her very calmly if she remembered what she'd texted me 9 days ago. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its desperate edge, replaced with something defensive. She tried to explain that they'd only wanted to protect Dad's assets, that my brother's wife had convinced them I was taking advantage of Dad's medical situation, that they were worried about their inheritance. Their inheritance, not Dad's home or his security or his medical care. Their inheritance. I explained very simply that since I was no longer family, I had no obligation to fund a mortgage on a house I'd been locked out of. She tried to interrupt, but I kept talking, my voice steady and cold. I told her exactly how much money I'd poured into that house over the past 7 months, every bill and payment and expense I'd covered while they were busy planning how to divide property that wasn't even theirs yet. Then I told her she had 30 days before the bank would begin foreclosure proceedings in earnest, and I hung up. My brother tried a different approach. He showed up at my apartment that evening, standing in the hallway with his hands in his pockets, looking more uncomfortable than I'd ever seen him. He tried to appeal to family loyalty, to our shared history, to Dad's health, and how stress could trigger another heart attack. I asked him if he'd considered any of that before changing the locks and having my sister text me like I was some unwanted tenant being evicted. He couldn't meet my eyes when he admitted it had been his wife's idea, that she'd convinced him and our sister that I was positioning myself to take control of Dad's estate, that they needed to protect their interests. I asked him if he'd bothered to check with Dad about any of this, if her father had actually agreed to cut me out, or if they'd simply steamrolled him while he was recovering. The look on his face told me everything I needed to know. I gave him the same information I'd given our sister. 30 days. Figure it out yourselves. I closed the door while he was still trying to formulate an argument. The calls continued for a week, each one more desperate than the last. My sister offered to pay me back for the mortgage, somehow coming up with promises of money I knew she didn't have. My brother tried to negotiate, suggesting we could work out a payment plan, that they'd add my name to the deed if I just fixed this one problem. I didn't bother responding to most of them. The few times I did answer, I simply asked if they'd reconsidered their position about me not being family anymore. 15 days after the foreclosure notice arrived, Dad called. His voice was weak, tired, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt my resolve waver. He didn't apologize directly, didn't offer explanations or excuses. Instead, he asked if I could come by the house to talk. When I reminded him that I no longer had a key, he was quiet for a long moment before saying he'd leave the front door unlocked. I almost didn't go. The smart part of me knew it was probably an ambush, my siblings waiting to gang up and pressure me into saving them from consequences of their own making. But I couldn't ignore the exhaustion in Dad's voice, the way he'd sounded like he'd aged another decade in just 2 weeks. The house looked the same as always when I pulled up, but something about it felt different, like I was seeing it through a stranger's eyes now. The front door was indeed unlocked, and I found Dad alone in the living room, sitting in his recliner with the television muted. He looked smaller somehow, shrunken into himself in a way that had nothing to do with his physical health. He asked me to sit, and I took the couch where I'd spent dozens of evenings keeping him company during his recovery. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he told me he'd made a terrible mistake. Not in listening to my siblings, though he admitted that was part of it, but in not standing up for me when they'd started their campaign to cut me out. He'd been tired and overwhelmed and had let them convince him it was for the best, that I'd be relieved to be free of the responsibility. I asked him directly if he'd actually agreed to change the locks. He looked away, staring at some point beyond the window, and admitted he hadn't even known about it until after it was done. My sister had convinced him it was just a precaution, a way to make sure the house stayed secure while he was having bad days. He hadn't understood she meant to keep me out until I'd stopped coming around. The anger I'd been carrying started to crack at the edges. This old man in his recliner wasn't the enemy, wasn't the one who'd orchestrated my exile. He'd been a pawn in my siblings' game just as much as I had, too weak and confused to fight back against their manipulation. But knowing that didn't change the fundamental betrayal. He'd let it happen. When they'd changed the locks and sent that text, he'd remained silent. All those days I'd waited for his call, for some sign that I still mattered to him. He'd stayed quiet while my siblings blocked every attempt I made to reach him. I told him I'd reinstate the mortgage payments on one condition. He nodded before I even said it, probably already knowing what was coming. I wanted everything in writing. Legal documents, drafted by a lawyer, that spelled out my authority over his medical and financial decisions, naming me as power of attorney and executor of his estate. My siblings would have no say in his care, no access to his accounts, no ability to make decisions on his behalf. If they wanted to visit, they were welcome, but they would never again have the power to lock me out of my own father's life. He agreed without hesitation, and something in his quick acceptance made me wonder if this was what he'd wanted all along. If maybe he'd been too tired to fight his other children and had needed me to force the issue. We sat in that living room for another hour while I called a lawyer I knew and set up an emergency appointment for the following day. Dad signed every document without reading them fully, trusting me in a way he probably shouldn't have, given everything that had happened. The mortgage payment went through that night. I sat at my laptop and manually processed it, watching my account balance drop by $4,000, and felt nothing but emptiness. This wasn't victory. This was just damage control, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of what I'd thought family meant. My siblings found out about the new arrangements within 48 hours. My sister showed up at Dad's house screaming about how I'd manipulated a sick old man, how I'd taken advantage of the situation to steal their inheritance. I was there when it happened, having stopped by to make sure Dad took his afternoon medications, and I watched from the doorway as she stood in the living room making accusations that would have destroyed me 2 weeks earlier. Now they just bounced off like rain on glass. I asked her very calmly where she'd been during Dad's physical therapy sessions, during the medication adjustments, during the nights he'd woken up confused and frightened from his pain medication. I asked her how many doctor's appointments she'd driven him to, how many meals she'd cooked, how many hours she'd spent making sure he wasn't alone in this house when his heart was still recovering. She didn't have answers, just more accusations and demands that I reverse everything. I told her the same thing I'd told her on the phone. She declared I wasn't family, and I believed her. Everything that came after was just me taking her at her word. If she wanted to be involved in Dad's life now, she was welcome to visit, but she'd never again have the authority to lock me out or make decisions that affected his well-being. My brother tried a more measured approach, suggesting family therapy, mediation, some kind of structured conversation where we could work through our issues. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. We'd moved past the point where talking could fix anything. They'd shown me exactly who they were when they thought they held all the power, and I had no interest in giving them another opportunity to prove it. The following months settled into a new routine. I continued managing Dad's care, visiting regularly, handling his finances and medical appointments. My siblings would occasionally stop by, their visits awkward and strained, always watching me like they expected me to abuse my new authority the way they'd abused theirs. I never did. I made decisions based solely on what was best for Dad, consulted with his doctors, kept meticulous records of every expense and every medical decision. The house stayed out of foreclosure. Dad's health continued to improve slowly, and I learned to live with the hollowness that had replaced whatever I'd felt for my siblings before they'd sent that text message. We were cordial when necessary, civil when required. But the bond that had once connected us was gone, cauterized by their choices and my response to them. Sometimes I wonder if I should have handled it differently, if there was a way to salvage the relationship while still protecting myself and Dad. Then I remember standing in that parking lot reading those 9 words, feeling my entire understanding of family crumble around me. And I know I made the only choice possible. They taught me I wasn't family. I simply believed them. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.